Hi, everyone. It's great to be able to see you. This is very unusual for a Zoom kind of experience where more or less you end up talking to yourself like a confessional in a church or something. So it's great to see some faces and bodies. And it's a thrill to be here with you today, even though I have to do this remotely from Melbourne, which is still in lockdown, 250 days. So I feel like Marquis de Sade or something in the Bastille. So just a prisoner, but we will be free one day. So I'm here to talk to you about the sound installation you heard, Atmospheres and Disturbances, which is essentially based on field recordings I made in Jungfraujoch at the high altitude research station there. So I'm going to share my PDF. And so it'll give you some visual kind of information regarding the project. And I'll just speak to that. I'll use the PDF as a prompt. And of course, I'm happy to receive questions anytime, whether during the presentation or afterwards. So I'll keep an eye on the time. So I'll try and move along quickly. But again, thank you for the invitation, Christoph, and all the help that you and Virginie have provided me for today's symposium. Atmospheres and Disturbances, Mapping the Sound Ecology of the Bernese Alps is the title of my talk. And some of you will no doubt recognize this famous image by Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which is a lovely metaphor for today's presentation, although the image that I have here is a mural that I took a photo of at the Jungfrau research station, and it's a little bit decrepit, it's peeling away, it's a bit faded, but it's I love the significance of it. The wanderer sitting above the clouds, contemplating the majestic alpine landscape and all the terror and all the beauty that it holds. So a little bit about myself. I'm inspired by cold climates, essentially. So I've done a significant amount of work in Antarctica, and I continue to work in Antarctica. So I'll be going to Antarctica next year for an extended trip to Australia's most remote and oldest research station, Mawson, on our new icebreaker that's just been commissioned very, very recently. And my job is to document the sound of the icebreaker traveling to Mawson Station and then spend several months on station recording the sound of the station itself and then the surrounding environment, including the emperor penguin colonies. So this is a photo by Frank Hurley taken in 1912, so a little bit over 100 years ago, out in the blizzard at Cape Denison, adjacent to winter quarters. What I love about this photo is that Frank Hurley tried to replicate the experience of a blizzard, something that's impossible to document with conventional photography. So he staged that scene. So those men out there in the blizzard opposed, they're actors essentially, pretending to be fighting against the wind. And he created the image through composite photographic techniques, so double exposure and so forth, to create this feeling of this extreme environment. And this particular image inspired my last trip to Antarctica in 2016, where I traveled to Casey Station, which is Australia's largest research station in Eastern Antarctica. And my job was to record the actual thing that Frank Hurley was trying to do 100 years ago. So I did it with sound rather than photography. But I also sat out in the blizzard and recorded until all my equipment froze. And I lasted, in this instance, about 4 hours before they had to drag me out of the field and put me back into the hut. So I'm very much interested in documenting these extreme environments, extreme in the sense of extreme cold, extreme remoteness, challenging physically, mentally, extremely challenging to the sound recording technology that I'm using. And so whilst I've been recording in Antarctica for over 10 years, I became very interested in the idea of how I might apply these ideas to a vertical landscape. So my starting point, more or less, of course, is Hodler and his paintings, a little bit like Hurley's photographs. I was looking at these paintings and imagining what they might sound like orally, you know, their soundscapes, their acoustic ecology. So in 2019, I applied to the High Altitude Research Station at Jungfrau, asking whether I could spend a month there recording the research station and the surrounding alpine environment, which is pretty much the one that you're seeing here, painted by Hodler 100 odd years ago in 1911. And in October 2019, I travelled to Jungfrau, and to start work on a new project, Atmospheres and Disturbances. And so this is the landscape that I found myself in, which is very, very different to the one I find myself in Antarctica, which is essentially flat, horizontal landscape. This is obviously a very challenging vertical landscape, lots of crevasses and very challenging topography, as you know, being a Swiss audience, as you well know. So it's unusual for me to be presenting to a Swiss audience. Normally it's an Australian audience I'm presenting this kind of PowerPoint to. And so if you don't already know it, and some of you no doubt know it in one way or another, you've probably visited it. There it is on the right-hand side. Hopefully you can see the PDF okay. Overlooking Munch. And so this is where I spent about 3 weeks recording the sound of the environment. And I was very interested in trying to trace the effects of climate change on this particular location. And so I used a whole range of different types of recording methodologies and techniques in order to capture that. So the piece that you heard today is one of the major outcomes that I produced from the field work. So it's unusual, again, for you to have heard the work itself. Often I have to spend a lot of time describing it. But by and large, what you're hearing is this landscape, the natural kind of sound of the wind and the ice granules blowing across the Great Altish Glacier, as well as the sound of the research station and the attendant scientific research that is occurring there. So this is just an image to give audiences a sense of the terrain that I was recording in. And that's just another angle in which I was just photographing the landscape that I was working in. And there's the Great Altish Glacier extending southwards, and the research station on the left-hand side, or at least part of the station complex where the train arrives. So it's a splendid landscape to operate within, very challenging in terms of topography, in how one navigates and negotiates this particular environment. Clearly there are some areas that you can't access and others you can. I found it extremely hazardous compared to my other experiences, particularly in Antarctica, because it's such an unstable environment, and that's particularly being impacted. It's an environment, sorry, that's particularly being impacted by climate change and the effects of global warming, which was very evident when I was there. And so here I am. It's basically a selfie. Just often people ask, well, how do I do it, and what am I doing, and what's the equipment that I'm using, and so forth. By and large, I'm composing as I'm recording. So that's one of the key methodologies that I'll talk to now. I tend to do about 80 to 85% of my composing whilst I'm recording in the field. So I'm applying the microphones to subject matter that is being shaped by the particular environmental characteristics and dynamics that are occurring at any given time. And so what I'm trying to do here is just capture the sound of the wind blowing across the glacier. And I'm listening to it very carefully through the microphones that I've got there, and imagining as a composition how I'd use those recordings. So I'm often having to kind of justify the work that I'm doing by saying that I don't process, manipulate, or abstract the recordings that I'm working with. I'm trying to create as pure and authentic an experience of the environment as I possibly can as I found it. And so this is kind of the way I'm working. So I spend about 3 to 4 weeks on a location like this, walking, listening, thinking, and trying to find its voice in some shape or form. And once I've got its voice, when I get back into the studio at home or something like that, it's more or less making a selection as to the best representation of those particular characteristics and creating a sequence of events from that point. So there is some choreography or some composing that goes on there. But by and large, I'm interested in the post-studio practice in which the environment is the studio rather than my temporary home studio, if you will, being the site of a lot of the creative decisions. So we can talk about that a bit more a bit later if you like. Again, some of the landscape in terms of I was operating within the crevassing that you're seeing here is one of the indicators of clearly climate change. Now, these type of environments are often in transformation. They warm and cool. Snow melts and then it refreezes and things of that nature. But there's clearly a transformation that was going on here at the time that I was there. That was unusual, and it's unusual for the scientists that I was talking to at the time as well. So I'm a novice, and I'm also an outsider. I'm from Australia, not Switzerland, so the terrain is all new to me. And trying to read it is like reading a new language as well. So I was being guided by the scientists in what was happening to the landscape, and so this is kind of one of the reasons I was kind of on location and trying to record this environment in many respects to advocate for it, but also to preserve it, because if it is melting and being transformed by global warming, then it's going to disappear eventually. And so the recordings that I'm making in some way is a record of the sound of this particular environment at a very specific time in history as well. So I'm thinking about it as people who might listen to these recordings in 100 years or 200 years when potentially the Great Altish Glacier has disappeared. So I think about it as kind of as science fiction, if you will, in some way. I think about the future and how the future listens to these kind of recordings that we're making today. Atmospherics are a big part of what I'm interested in. So fog, ice, wind, the sun, the quality of light, those kinds of things really affect the way I'm listening to an environment, hence the title, Atmospherics and Disturbances. And so they all kind of inform the way the landscape sounds in very specific ways, and therefore the way it's recorded is also impacted. And so no 2 days were ever alike when I was at the research station. And that's always exciting because you have to think on your feet all the time. You always have to be open to the unexpected. You can't be you can't assume, I guess, is essentially what I'm saying. So just because it was sunny yesterday doesn't mean it's going to be sunny today. Just because it was still yesterday doesn't mean it will be still today. So you need to be active and to be responsive to the dynamics or to the characteristics that confront you at any given time. And I like that. It's got a sense of the improvisation around it. So on one hand, I'm very interested in post-studio practice where the environment is my studio, and also these ideas around improvisation, spontaneity of not going in with a plan, but to be responsive to kind of to find something within the landscape itself that wants to be heard, I guess, is probably what I'm thinking about or what I'm trying to do, rather than force my own particular agenda or aesthetic sensibility onto the location itself. Just a couple of ways I'm setting up the microphones. Certainly landslides or rock falls were a big part of the landscape that I was working within. So setting up some omnidirectional microphones for long periods of time, up to 3 or 4 hours at a time on the glacier. Oh, excuse me. It was a way of just getting those very, very infrequent kinds of events. And you may have heard the big booming sound of the glacier calving in the composition. So that was achieved by just having microphones like this running for several hours. And then I got a couple of really fantastic, really intense recordings of the glacier calving. And on the bottom right there is just one of the omnidirectional microphones I was using against the basically the surface of the glacier, so getting the ice granules kind of blowing across the microphone again, which you may have heard. It's like a sizzle sound, and it's these millions and millions of ice granules dancing around the microphone, which I loved very, very much. It just meant that I had to dress properly. I sat with, clearly you can't leave the equipment out for too long, so I sat with the equipment and tried to kind of keep the ice off, or just at least brush the ice off as much as I possibly can to protect the gear. But it requires a certain amount of stamina and stubbornness to kind of to work in these particular environments. And so a big part of what I was interested in was the atmospheric research that was occurring at the research station. So on one hand, it's the natural environment, but it's the science that's happening within this environment and what it's telling us about the future of the planet, which is really interesting to me. And as an artist, I kind of wonder often how I can express these ideas, this kind of the research that's going on, the complexity of the science within a sound art framework, essentially. And so again, in the composition, you would have heard the sound of all these instruments within the composition itself. It's the sound of these labs and all the specific instrumentation that you find within them that is really of great interest to me. So by that, I'm probably saying that I'm as much as interested in kind of the anthropogenic qualities of a place as I am the natural or the atmospheric or the environmental qualities of a particular location as well. I'm actually thrilled by these sounds. In fact, the sound of the atmospheric research lab and things like these special platforms measuring solar and atmospheric radiation. They're beautiful objects, as well as they sound really quite interestingly to me also. Which kind of, I put this in as a prompt because Chloe Dewey Matthews is a photographer that did a residency with the Verbia 3D Foundation there in Verbia for a project called In Search of Frankenstein's Mary Shelley's Nightmare. And I put it in here because I'm drawn to the way science is being depicted in literature and in art and more or less in sound as well. So when I was in the atmospheric research labs, I felt like I was in a movie set from something from a sci-fi film from the 50s or so. The War of the Worlds is one that comes to mind, where science is kind of like, you know, in some ways it's science is trying to kind of help save humanity. In War of the Worlds, it's the scientists who are struggling to kind of grab their instruments whilst society crumbles at the threat of these flying saucers coming and destroying everything. And it's an idea that really strikes me. And similarly with Howard Hawks's The Thing from, I think, about 1951, it's the scientists trying to advocate and preserve the monster that is trying to destroy the station. So trying to understand it whilst it is also trying to kill them. And there's something about science fiction and the way science fiction has been represented in popular culture that speaks to me and my practice. And by visiting to these Antarctic bases are highly technical environments, and visiting the HFSJG as well. They're highly technical and sophisticated environments. They're extremely exciting places to be and to observe from an artistic point of view. And I love that very much. It's one of the great driving forces. But as they keep telling me, the scientists struggle to have their science, their message heard. And therefore artists like myself, Chloe here, and others are often supported to kind of help convey the message of what it is they're doing. So there's kind of a certain kind of advocacy, I guess, or the role of an advocate as much as an artist for the work that these people are doing, which becomes a very important part of the work you do. Just a few more shots, and I'm sure these are kind of familiar images for some of you in Switzerland. The tunnelling, it's something like the Jungfrau-Joch area is highly technical and highly constructed, of course, as is much of Switzerland, clearly. And coming across dynamite crews setting up a blast operation is not something I see every day. So, you know, that certainly took me by surprise as they kind of drove a fork truck full of dynamite and fuses in front of me without any sense of what we'd call OH&S here in Australia, health and safety officers kind of keeping people away. It was quite a surprise and quite a thrill, I've got to say. And just some more kind of technical kind of demonstration ambisonic recording within the station itself. So I'm trying to record the spatial characteristics of these environments through ambisonic recording. So here you're kind of getting a portal into the outside whilst hearing the kind of material quality of the research station as well. The way the sound kind of resounds within this kind of concrete room is really special. Also kind of gives you a sense of pressure or closeness to the recording as something like the wind blowing outside is occurring. And again, you would hear some of that in the installation you would have heard. A few other kind of techniques there. On the right-hand side, I use accelerometers to capture metal stress and fatigue in built environments, such as remote research stations. The accelerometers I'm using have an operating kind of range of around about -50 to about +150, so they can record very cold and very hot surfaces. And allows me to get some really great recordings of metal under various states of fatigue, so different resonances and things of that nature. I'm just conscious of time, so I won't drag on too much. So this is clearly one that might be familiar to some of you. It's currently on in Verbia, so thanks to Verbia 3D. For supporting my work. It's, if you don't know it, it's a 5-kilometre sound walk that you can do near Verbia, walking an alpine route, and along the route there's about 15 field huts and panels with images of things that I've taken whilst doing sound recording in Antarctica and the Bernese Alps, and a 90-minute composition of different forms and behaviours of ice and water that I've recorded in Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, and the Bernese Alps as well, more or less the sound of melting landscapes, with the idea that the listener is then kind of implicated in some way to how these environments are being transformed by global warming as they're walking an alpine route, and then kind of imagining the future of this particular ecology that they're walking through. There's a couple of extra detailed images of the panels, and you'll see the microphone again now in a different context, taken from my field document into an artwork kind of scenario. So a really fabulous way to kind of bring the body into the experience. You know, walking through a landscape whilst listening is a very different way of listening to an artwork than to kind of listen to one in a concert hall situation or in a kind of an art gallery as well. Just a couple of other details, and the lovely play between the panels and the immediate landscape around it, kind of suggesting a kind of both a relationship and a point of departure or difference as well, you know, potentially what was there and now what is there kind of thing. So a little bit speculative in that sense. And very quickly, another kind of artwork I've done, Flow, is an outcome from some of the work I did in Antarctica. It's a 3D printed architectural form that Roland Snooks created through robotic printing. And it's an extremely successful exhibition that we did at the NGV in Melbourne, and it attracted 300,000 people in 1 month. And it's the one time in my life as a sound artist that I've been working for 35 years, and it's the first time that I've managed to get an audience of that kind of size, and it was something. It was transformative in the sense of I hadn't changed a thing that I'd done. However, the audience, with this kind of fear of climate change and this attraction to Antarctica, really showed an enormous commitment to this particular project, and they were getting about 15 to 20,000 people per day into this thing. And it's 16-channel sound installation comprising the different forms and behaviours of ice I recorded in Antarctica. And Roland's kind of built this architectural form, which you're kind of seeing a part of, but it's actually really enormous in response to the sound recordings. And often it's flipped around. As I tell my students, we're normally asked to sound design something like a movie or an architectural form, but in this instance, the sound led the architectural response, which is great. And Roland and I are currently developing a new project. It's unfortunately COVID has delayed the presentation of it, but it's Unclear Cloud, and it's more or less the work that I've been doing in Switzerland placed within a new architectural form. So I'm taking the recordings that I've made in and above the clouds of Switzerland, and Roland's creating an architectural shape and form in response to the virtual cloud or cloud storage. And together, our two ideas of the cloud converge. And this is a prototype that we produced for China. It's a bit of a rough idea. It's quite enormous, of what we're working towards together for the NGV here in Melbourne, which opens, I think, next month once we're out of lockdown. Bit of a flavour for how Roland is kind of taking ideas of the cloud and trying to kind of create an architectural form. And whilst you're looking at this, you're hearing the installation that you've basically heard, kind of surrounding and embodying the installation. So it's a really interesting marriage of ideas. And just getting towards the end here. So yes, it's very quick, and I hope it was okay. But project partners are incredibly important. That I had the support of the HFSJG at Jungfrau Joch, the ICST, who you probably know from Zurich University Arts, hosted me as a composer in resident to kind of work through the field recordings I'd done and to construct a composition, basically a prototype of the installation that I'm presenting here at the symposium. And I also should acknowledge the Swiss National Science Foundation for supporting my project as well. It's, according to them, it's one of the rare or unusual kind of projects for them, being an artist-led research project. And so I'm extremely grateful to them for their support of the project. So I'll stop sharing my screen here, and here I am with you. So I guess I'm landed there, but I'm just conscious of the fact that you kind of have heard the piece, so you may have some questions or thoughts or something you might want to share with the available time that we have.
So I think we can take maybe like 7
Sure.
minutes for questions. Is there any questions?
Hello, thank you for the presentation. Did you record during the day and during the night?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, I stayed at the research station as well, so they have accommodation there, so I was able to record at night time during the day, and it sounds different, of course, at different times. And so the thing about the Jungfraujoch is that it's a massive tourist destination. So I wasn't expecting so many tourists, and all the noise that they make was a big challenge. And it's not that it's not important, because that's part of the soundscape and that's part of the anthropogenic nature of that environment. But it just meant that trying to record anything beyond tourist sounds and the sound of helicopters and jet planes and things like that was extremely difficult. And again, I wasn't expecting it, and therefore I had to kind of adapt and work very early before the tourists arrive, and very late after the tourists left. And it's a very strange place without the tourists. Once you get used to the tourists, tens of thousands of people there, all jammed in, and I've got my microphones. I'm trying to get past them and things like that. It becomes a war. And then it's nothing. You're just by yourself. It's really transformative. I mean, you feel extremely different, and the sounds are very different at that time too.
In a way, you're recording future nostalgia of something that is going to disappear. There's also a bit of sadness.
Yeah, it can be emotional for some people. Certainly the Antarctic work is emotional for people, because everyone has an opinion, and some people believe in climate change. Some in Australia, there's quite a lot of people who refuse to believe in climate change. And so people bring their own narrative, their own fears, their own biases, and apply it on the recordings. So I try not to be too didactic in how I present the work. So I tend to try and use poetic titles, and I try and allow the listeners or the audiences to form their own opinions on what they think they're listening to and how it makes them feel. So it's important not to try and push a message. I think we hear so much about the critical kind of, I guess, point that we're at, the tipping point of climate change, that perhaps it's all too late, and but you can be despairing, and that creates kind of inaction, and it's better to go down fighting than not to try. And so it's a very kind of sometimes difficult subject to kind of broach with audiences and things. However, nostalgia is a good point. I often it's more and more in my mind, because it's not what I started out to do. I wanted to kind of reveal these very strange places, these research stations at the edge of the world. That's what I was interested in. Go, where are these places? Who are these people? Why do they go there? What's going on in these places? So it was a mystery. And I was very interested to know, with the microphones, okay, so what's going on here? And then over time, it becomes, a very, very serious kind of investigation. These people are here to try and preserve our future in some shape or form. So they're working hard at the service of humanity. And then you become implicated in that. Whether you like it or not, you become the messengers. So, okay, well, these people are serious and they're dedicated and they suffer a lot. These people, it's no holiday. And therefore, the work that you do is not entertainment. It becomes very, very serious, and they become a record of a certain time and a certain kind of struggle. And that's what becomes, over 10 or 15 years, I've got this archive of hundreds and hundreds of hours of recordings of these environments, many of which don't exist anymore. And so there's a kind of nostalgia and sadness about some of that. also. So there's kind of a gravitas to what you do sometimes. But it's great that sound is at the forefront of this. Sound more and more. You know, sound art used to be, yes, the lunatic kind of art form in galleries where you destroy pianos and kind of string up wires and amplify bridges and stuff like that. And now it's like at the service of, you know, the environment, it's service of science, it's the service of humanity. So it's become this much bigger thing. And that's really interesting and very exciting for anyone studying in the field, that you can kind of work between the canon of 20th, 21st century avant-garde experimental music and sound art, but you can also apply it to new knowledge and new ways of experiencing the world. And I think that's really, really great.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you very much. I can see another element of nostalgia behind you.
Nostalgia? Where the cuckoo clock, or?
Yes.
Yep. From the Black Forest, it's the real deal.
It's not the Swiss one.
Ah, sorry. It's the German one, sorry.
What did you do? We are so disappointed. Virginie has a question.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm asking the question for Virginie, but it's actually a two-part question. Can you talk a bit more about your real-time composition process? And secondly, that was Virginie's question, but I'm also interested in that. How much did you, if at all, manipulate the sound?
As I was saying earlier during the presentation, I know I had to go quite quickly, but I hate studios, and it's a reaction to that. I found as a student and as an emerging composer that I created very uninteresting music in ideal studio situations where I controlled everything. Everything sounded uniform and uninteresting to me. And that's because I was in control of everything, and there was the computer and everything else like that. So I became much more interested in breaking that down and opening myself up to a situation that I couldn't control. And so going and working in the field and going unprepared is also a big part of it. And so not knowing what I was going to was one thing. And then not having any clear agenda as to what I was doing there was another thing. So being spontaneous and improvisatory in every sense of the word. But I had confidence in my ability to record. You know, I know what I can do as a sound recordist. And I know the technology that I work with intimately. So if I'm in any situation, I can get an outcome. I can find something interesting. And so that's become a big part of my methodology, is to kind of to be responsive to the way I find myself in the world. And just to finally say that I don't like to process or abstract or manipulate sound, because it has been done so much and so well by so many people that I'd rather use microphone technique, selection, subject matter, and the conditions that I find myself as the material that I work with. And therefore the composing becomes this, you know, a slight arrangement of the things that I've recorded. But again, it becomes a minor player rather than the major focus. I think that's the important thing for me. So I spend very little time at home composing. You know, I do all the work outside, and then I come home and put my feet up and have a cup of tea and read a good book, and, you know, try and stay off the computer as much as possible.
Thank you, Philip.
Thanks.
Is it 10 past 11 on your side?
It is. I had my coffee, so, you know, to keep me going.
We will have beef from tonight. It will be 7 in the morning for him.
Yes.
So that's the word. Thank you very much, Philip.